We'd like to welcome you to the final class of the day. Instructor is Julie Wilcox. We'd like to thank her for her time and expertise sharing it with us. And without further delay, we'll turn the time over to her.
For those that maybe are new to any of my classes, I've been teaching family history for about 13 years now. I've been doing research for about 48. And this is a topic that I really enjoy. I've been digging deep into death records lately because of a personal family history book that I'm doing about tragic deaths on the family tree, and it's a very interesting topic. So let's start right out with a variety of places that you might find death and burial information. So just before we started, a gentleman was asking about Canadian government records. Government records, such as your death certificates or death indexes, all start at different times depending on the location. So you need to do just a little bit of research, preferably probably on the wiki, to find out when such records are available. There are some other government type records that might be available, such as pension records and wills. If you're looking for children, that's a totally different story. Also check your city, county, and state archives. They might have specific records that were kept prior to those official certificates, and we'll talk about some of those and how you might be able to find them. Church records can be extremely helpful when you're able to access them. If you know what church a family attended, what their religion was, and if there are records available for that location and time, they can be really helpful. Some countries, that's the first place you will look for death records, such as your Scandinavian countries. It's the church records that kept those burials. And of course, newspapers, all kinds of different articles might have the death information that you're looking for, not just obituaries. And there are additional places where you might find that information you're looking for, such as land and property records, military records, court records, funeral homes, and more. So we're going to talk about all of these different types of things that you might find. Our favorite go-to is a death certificate, but not every death, of course, is going to be recorded on a death certificate. Some death certificates will have a lot more information than others. Here's a list of some of the things that you might find on a death certificate, including things such as their parents or spouse, their occupation. So a lot more than just the date of death and the cause of death. Be aware that some of the information on a death certificate might actually be wrong. The primary information is that death date and place and the cause of death. But whoever the informant was might not have had the accurate information for the parents or maybe their birth date. And just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at death certificates. In the United States, every state has an archive. They don't all have the same amount of digital images available online. You might only find an index online, but look at the state archives and you will be able to see when those death certificates were available and find out if there's something online that might not be found on one of our key genealogy websites, such as Family Search or Ancestry. This is just the homepage for the Utah Division of Archives and Records Service, and sometimes I've been able to find records on the archives that weren't as easy to find on the other sites because maybe they weren't indexed properly. And each year the database grows on those online archives. This is just the homepage for the Alabama Department of Archives and History, just to show that each state has a different look, they function differently. You might need to play around with it a little bit to see how best to use it. And you might be able to reach out to individuals that can help you to find exactly what you're looking for and what's available. I have a sister that's in Alabama who has often reached out to other states for research, and some are willing to help a lot more than others. So it just depends on where you're looking and what's available online and what isn't. The amount of information that's typically indexed on Family Search or Ancestry with the death certificate is kind of minimal. This is just one example on our family tree. I was looking for a marriage record actually for Joseph Wilson Patillo and was a little surprised to find a death certificate for 1931. He was born in 1900, so he was pretty young when he died. I know it's him because of the parents' names there that helped me to know that I had the right person. If I didn't look at that actual image, I would have missed out on an entirely big story. Sometimes we quickly will add a source and not really look at the images to see what else we can learn from it. So when I took a closer look at this death certificate, this is what I saw. And it was packed with information. First of all, I learned that he really was married. Later, after finding that marriage record, I know that the informant is his wife. I also discovered that his occupation is golf pro, which is a real unusual kind of occupation. I see where he's buried, which is in Georgia. And of course, I know, the date of death and the cause of death is there. That cause of death was really complicated and interesting. And I even Googled some of those terms, such as transverse myelitis. What is that? Well, if you look, you can see that that's actually a traumatic puncture wound. And it says that he had a spinal puncture. In the red box, you see that this was a homicide. He was shot. And it was interesting that he was shot in Montgomery, Alabama, but died in Atlanta, Georgia. So I know that he didn't die immediately. We started looking for an obituary, didn't find one. I thought surely a homicide would have a lot of news. And it took going back in time a ways before I finally found articles about his death. He was actually shot in August and didn't die until January the following year. He was paralyzed from the wound. We learned that it was a woman that shot him, and he said he didn't want to press charges, and they claimed that it was accidental because they were scuffling over the pistol. But the doctors said there's no way that particular injury could have happened from a scuffle. So it was an interesting situation. And these are just a few of the articles we found, which is a whole story we would have missed out on if I had just added that source without looking at the actual image. So every state has kind of their own rules for death certificates, and different countries also. So what do you do if you can't find a death certificate? I know, for example, that Arkansas did not start having official statewide death certificates until 1914. Georgia didn't begin until 1919. We have some in Utah as early as 1904, but statewide registration really took place in 1905. So every state was just a little bit different, and you need to know when those dates are, and the wiki is a great place to find out what the dates are for when those records began. So if there isn't a death certificate for that time period that you're looking for, find out what alternate sources are available. We call them substitute records. So this is just an example from a typical page on the wiki. This is for the state of Georgia. That blue button that I've circled is a link to a list of online genealogy records specifically for that place. Every country, or most of them, will have a blue button like that as well. And then all of the links are categorized, so you can easily find online places where you might find death records. You can also, over on the right, select the different record types that might have the information you're looking for: Bible records, cemeteries, church records, your vital records, newspapers, and so forth. All might have something about the deaths that you're looking for. On the wiki, you can also see substitute records. So they will let you know when those statewide registrations began for a state, and then what to do if you're looking for records for an earlier time. And it will have links to things like available church records, newspapers, and even census records that might help you to find out, that death information you're looking for. This is a different page from the Family Search Wiki on how to find United States death records, and they list every single state. You click on the blue link and it opens up the page for that state and will help to give you guidance for that specific place, because they're all a little bit different. And the different countries that I've worked outside the United States have different ways of recording deaths and burials as well. And the wiki is a really great place to start to see what's available, what's online, and maybe who you can contact for records that are not online. So we're going to look at a couple of what we would call substitute records if there were no death certificates available for the time you're researching. This is just one example from Ancestry that's coroner and death records. You might find cemetery records, sexton records, coroner records, a different variety of things like that that were kept prior to and including the time that death certificates were. This particular one has records as early as 1881 and has a lot of the same information that you would find on a death certificate. I was researching a family in Tennessee and discovered that the Board of Health kept some death records as early as 1878. And during 1878, there was a huge yellow fever epidemic. So there were so many people that died from previous yellow fever epidemics that the government of Tennessee, the Board of Health, decided to keep a book, a register of the deaths. And this is just one side of the page of that book. They have a lot of great information. I was excited to find it because I was missing a family. There were like members from 3 generations of one family that just kind of disappeared. And I discovered that they did die in this yellow fever outbreak. This is the second page of that same Board of Health register. And you can see that top image that almost all of the individuals, the cause of death is yellow fever. At the same time, the newspaper in the area published a list of the individuals that passed away from that epidemic as they were able to get that information. And so I had found 2 different sources for those 1878 deaths. So look and see what was going on in the time period where your relatives were living and try to find what records were available. Sometimes they're unusual. This is a catalog listing from Family Search. Look at the catalogs on both Family Search and Ancestry to see what types of records might be available for the place that you're looking at. I always check the wiki and the catalogs and a couple other sources that we'll look at here in a minute. This particular record is a sexton's record for Bear River City that starts as early as 1868 in Utah. I've circled down at the bottom, you see the film number and the format. It shows the little camera icon. That means that this record isn't indexed, but I can still look at the images and browse those images. When I looked through them, I was able to find my great-grandparents who were immigrants from Denmark, and my great-great-grandfather, Hans Jorgensen, there with the blue star, died before there were death certificates. His wife there, Marion Dorothea Jorgensdottir, we do have a death certificate for her, but this particular record gives us where they were interred as well as the cause of death. And with some of our family medical history, that was important for us to try and keep track of what those cause of death was. So this was a great record to find. And there are many of these that are available. Not all of them are filmed and not available through Family Search, but see if the community has records like this, sexton records or cemetery records that you might be able to browse or have someone search for you if they're not in your location. Family Search also has a huge collection of records under the search tab that's images. These are records that are not even cataloged yet. So I always take a look at the catalog and see what's available. But if I go to images, I might find more collections. Yesterday, I looked and there were over 5,100,000 images available through this means. You can only search by place here because, of course, none of these records have been indexed, but you can search for even a small community. So you just can narrow your results down. So if I was looking in, say, Nebraska, I might want to narrow down to the county or even the city that I'm looking for. And be aware that records such as a sexton record might be on a city level, but a death certificate would be found on a state level. So you might need to look at both city, county, and state levels. And the same holds true for outside the United States, depending on where you're researching. You really need to know how they organized those records. This is just an example where I did a search through images only for Brevard County in Florida. Once I did that search, then I can refine my search. And you can see over on the right where I've put the red box that I've selected items that had to do with death, and there were 9 different things that might provide me with the information I was looking for. And then once you find a collection, you can browse those images and hopefully find what you're looking for. This is just an example of a record I found on the image-only groups from a necrology in Georgia. It's not indexed, but when you find a record like this, Family Search still makes it possible for us to attach them to our tree. And you can see the little box at the top of the page that says attach to the tree. Just follow the prompts and the steps, and it's a great way to link those items when you find them. I looked at unindexed records for Tallapoosa, Alabama, and there were a lot of results. And a lot of them did have something to do with death records. So it's worth taking a look at those image-only collections. And they're not just records for the United States. There are records for other countries as well. And just see what's available. Eventually, these will get cataloged and put into the catalog. Family Search is in the process of updating the catalog right now. But it'll take a while before all of these 5 billion records are indexed. So it's really worth taking your time to look at these. Here's just another example that I found. This is from those Tallapoosa records. This is a register of deaths that begins as early as 1889. Death certificates didn't begin until 1908. So again, similar information, just a register of deaths that's available for those early years. And you don't know what's available until you take a look in this huge, constantly growing collection of records. It's an outstanding resource that'll really underused. A lot of people just aren't taking advantage of it. This is a different type of record that you should take a look at if you are researching families from the United States. The federal census included a mortality schedule from 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880. And there are 6 states that also included a mortality schedule in 1885. Those are Colorado, Florida, Nebraska, New Mexico, and North and South Dakota. So I have found a lot of family members in these mortality schedules. This image shows just one example. Looking at the family surname Patillo, that's my mother's maiden name. It's an unusual surname. So sometimes I'll just search collections of records for that surname. and then occasionally pick up people that weren't already on the tree. This particular family, we see there's a 32-year-old Lucy, 17-year-old Sarah, 9-year-old Mary, and that last name, James, I think, was 12. All of them died of typhoid pneumonia, it says. So they were in an epidemic situation as well. The only problem with this collection of records is that it doesn't show relationships. So occasionally I will find children listed in this mortality schedule, and I don't know who the parents are. But if I search the regular census in the same location, I can usually match up that child with the correct family. But this is a wonderful resource. If you're not using it, Ancestry has a wonderful collection of mortality schedules, and you can just go to their catalog and type in federal census mortality schedules, and all the collections will come up and you can search within them. Here's another example from the mortality schedule. I found this mention of George Bailey. He was 15 years old when he died. It gives the cause of death and the date of death, all wonderful information long before there were death certificates. The arrow is pointing to a number that's on the far right. That's how many days the person was sick before they died. And in this case, he lived 3 days. So having that information and knowing which family he belonged to, I did a search in the newspapers and found this article about this situation, and it tells the whole story about what happened and how he was bitten and lingered for several days before he died. So the mortality schedule to me is real gold when I find something like that, because that's usually long before they had death certificates. Every genealogist is familiar with the Social Security Death Index. It's been around for a really long time. I remember back in the 60s going with my mother to the genealogy library and her looking up information in the death index. So it's been around a long time. This is a typical information that you'll find from the Social Security Death Index, and it's available on a lot of different websites, Family Search and Ancestry and others. You can see that in this case, it has the birth date of the individual. You get the Social Security number and the death date. Be aware that the last residence is not the place of death. I see a lot of people that make that mistake and put that as the place of death, but that doesn't mean that person died there. There's a better collection than the Social Security Death Index. It's available through Family Search and Ancestry, and it's the Social Security Applications and Claims on Ancestry. That's the title of the collection. On Family Search, it's called Numident. So this is also from Social Security records, but it gives us more information. So here we have the same person, but we also have the birthplace added. We see her parents listed and the times that her name was changed. If we didn't know when she got married, that could be really helpful information, and we could go backwards from that time that she had her name changed and perhaps find that marriage record. So this is a government record, but it's a wonderful resource. And if you're working on Family Search regularly, you're aware that lately there have been a lot of new record hints from Numident, and that's this Social Security record that can really be helpful. Attaching those records on Family Search, I've been able to add a lot of deaths, dates that I didn't previously have, and I'm still have a lot of sources that I'm looking through to attach those. I use Pozilla to find record hints that aren't attached, and if you're not using it, try that out. It'll help you find those Numident hints very quickly. You should be familiar with findagrave.com. There are several websites similar to Find a Grave. Find a Grave right now has over 190 million memorials, and it's constantly growing. A few years ago, Ancestry purchased Find a Grave, but they promised in a contract that they would always keep it free. So it's still a free website, but because Ancestry now owns it, there have been some improvements. Years ago, you could only search an exact name spelling on Find a Grave, but now you have the option to click the box that says similar name spellings. And I recommend that you always do that because you don't know if someone's name was spelled different than what you would expect, or maybe they were using a nickname or an abbreviation. So using that similar name spellings option has really been helpful. I also, when I find someone on Find a Grave, like to look and see other individuals from that family that might be buried in the same cemetery, county, or even the same state. If you're not familiar with the search tips for Find a Grave, go down to the bottom of the page and click on the link that will help you to understand how best to use the website. You can use wildcards. If you didn't know you can use wildcards, this is be really helpful. So look at the search tips for any website that you're using and get familiar with how best it works. They want you to come back and use it again, so they're going to offer tips and suggestions. This is just an example from Find a Grave. You will get record hints from Family Search and Ancestry for Find a Grave records. But how often do you actually go to the page and look at that record? Just like other sources, I always recommend look at that original source if you can. You might glean more information. In this example, we have some wonderful photographs and a full obituary that I didn't already have on Family Search. This is my great-great-grandfather, Enoch Bartlett Tripp, and this is an image from several years ago with the updates for Find a Grave. I'm going to show you a difference here in a minute. I recommend that you create a login on Find a Grave. You can create, it's free. All you need to do is include an email. And by logging in when you're using Find a Grave, it gives you the opportunity to suggest edits on a memorial or create a new memorial or add a photo or a document such as an obituary or a death certificate. It's very helpful to be able to have that edit capability because not all of the memorials are completely accurate. You might have more information that you can be added. In this example, there's a wonderful long, not obituary, but biography on Find a Grave for him. He had 5 wives, and all 5 wives are linked here, but he had 32 children. And here you only see a few of those children. So I did some edits and was able to suggest links to all of the other children. I do like that this also included where the burial plot is so that I could actually find him in the big Salt Lake City cemetery. This is the updated look on Find a Grave. And so it looks slightly different, but it has all the same information. Remember, you can always look for other individuals with that same name in that cemetery, county, or state. This is the links that I added for his family. So now we have all of the children linked. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have a login. So do create a login. Look at those records. There might be information you didn't already have. Look at the other family members. Watch for things that might be inaccurate, and then you can suggest edits or add new information if you have that as well. Find a Grave also has records from 243 different countries to date. So most of them are found under that same findagrave.com website, but a few actually have their own websites, such as this one for Find a Grave in Scotland. So do a little looking and see what's available for the country that you're looking at. We were just looking a little earlier before the class started. Canada, for example, has a website. We just saw the title is I think it's Canadian Headstones. It's similar to Find a Grave, same kind of thing where memorials are created with images of the headstones, but it's a subscription site. However, if you have a subscription to MyHeritage, you can access it through MyHeritage. So be familiar with the various websites. Use the wiki to find out which websites might have the cemetery records that you are looking for. This is just an example from a Canadian burial that is on the regular Find a Grave. Lots of different countries represented in that database. Billion Graves is another website that most of you should be familiar with. And people ask me all the time, what's the difference between Billion Graves and Find a Grave? Well, Billion Graves is created from photo images of the headstones. Not all of the memorials on Find a Grave actually have an image of the headstone. Billion Graves uses smartphones, and when individuals take photos of those headstones, the GPS coordinates are saved so that anyone looking at that can find those gravestones again. So it's a little different. You can also see people that are buried nearby, and often those are other family members. Billion Graves does create a little timeline, but it just uses historical events and the data that was on the headstone. So it doesn't place other family members and things such as the timeline you can find on Family Search. You can find exactly where that grave is in a cemetery, which can be super helpful when you're at a large cemetery trying to find that grave. The app for Billion Graves is absolutely free. In fact, right now they're getting ready to break a world record to upload the most headstone images in I think it's just in one day. So if you go to the website, you can learn about that. But it's free and it's a great service. I mentioned earlier, I have a sister that lives in Alabama. She has gone to some of the small cemeteries that are there that were not found on Billion Graves. And just as a service, on a Sunday afternoon, she'll go and take pictures, upload them, and then they need to be indexed. And once they've been indexed, then they're available for everyone to view. And you can even volunteer to help index headstone images. And they're pretty easy compared to some of the writing that people have been trying to index. Billion Graves also has a blog, and they have some great articles on their blog, so you might want to check that out if you're aware of that. Don't be afraid to actually visit a cemetery. See before you go if there's a sexton office at the cemetery, or if the sexton office is maybe in the city offices somewhere else. Find out what their hours are. See if you can actually talk to the sexton and see the sexton records. A few years ago, when I was at Cartersville, Georgia, we did our plans ahead of time, found out when the sexton would be at that cemetery, and met with him, and he was so helpful. My great-grandfather's sister was Ada Virginia Patillo, and she married William Eves. And we were looking for the family plot. It's a huge cemetery, and I never would have found it without his help. They do not have all of the graves at the time, were not on like Billion Graves or Find a Grave. The sexton record that you see here from his book is not available anywhere online. It hasn't been filmed, or wasn't years ago. And he just let me take a picture of it. So here I have that plot map, and I can see where everyone was buried. And there's all of the family members that are buried in this family plot. Really helpful information. Without that, I wouldn't have known that this is where my great-grandfather's sister, Ada Virginia, is buried. There's absolutely no marker on this wonderful big memorial. Her husband was a brick mason, and her sons were brick masons. And maybe at one time there was a marker that had her name, but today there's nothing there. So without that sexton record, I wouldn't have known that this was her burial site. Some sexton records are available on Family Search. through those images only, and some are indexed. So go to the catalog and see if there is sexton records available. This is one that is indexed and available through Family Search. It's Kaysville City Cemetery. Really helpful to have this because when we went to the cemetery a few years ago, there were a couple of the children's graves that we couldn't find. I was sure there were headstones, but we couldn't find them. By having this little plot map, we knew where, for example, little Maddie was buried, and we discovered that her headstone had been completely grown over with grass. And so we took some tools to get the grass off of her headstone and clear it off. And having that plot map was very helpful. Notice that these sexton records have a lot of great information, not just who's buried where, but the place of death and the date of interment, and very often they'll even have the cause of death and other family members. See if the cemetery that you're looking at or for has a website. Very often I will just Google cemeteries in a particular area or go to Google Maps and ask it to look for cemeteries or funeral homes in a certain city and do my research from there, find out what was available. My relative had to be buried in one of those cemeteries. This is a page from the Hollywood Cemetery in, I think we were in Richmond, Virginia. I'm sure Richmond. And it was a huge cemetery. And when we were there, we visited with the lady in the office there, and she was looking up family names on her card file, which was huge. It was like a gigantic Rolodex that was 4 feet long and lots and lots and lots of cards. And it wasn't until we came home that I discovered that they have a website, and she could have simply looked up the information on her computer. So it was a little amusing, but it was really interesting. So see if the cemetery you're looking for has a website, and they might have different information. So some are extremely detailed and really helpful, and some don't have quite as much information, but it's always worth checking out. The headstone itself, when you're able to find one, might provide you with information that you didn't have before, that might tell you about that person. This one in the center for Robert Sidney Patillo, I wanted to mention it. We took a picture of it because someone had done a rubbing, and it did help make the words more visible, but please don't do chalk rubbings on headstones. It can actually damage them. But when you look at his headstone, there's a big symbol right in the middle, and that's the symbol for the Masons. So I knew he was a Mason, and we were then able to find information about him and his family from the Masonic records and from news articles that the Masons put in to the newspaper. If you look at the one right below that for Jack King, it was his headstone that helped me to learn, even though it's very small and not a lot of information, but I learned that he was a veteran from World War II and was in the Navy. And also that little symbol told me that he was a Christian. So look at the headstone and see if it tells you a story. See if you can glean any more information from that headstone. Some are really amazing and have a lot of information, and others can be really frustrating because they don't have much at all. But you don't know until you actually take a look at it. There is a wonderful page on the wiki that's titled United States Cemeteries, and they try to keep these up to date. If you look on the left, you can see that there are links to some other online cemetery websites, but you can click on any of the states and then it will list cemeteries for that state. Great, quick, easy way to find cemeteries for the place that you're researching. And I always use Google. Google's a wonderful research tool. We're so blessed with the tools that we have online. When we were going to pass through Nebraska several years ago, we stayed a couple of nights in Lincoln, and we were researching a family that lived in Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska. And I just did some Googles. We didn't know for sure which cemetery the family was buried in. Found out there were a lot of cemeteries in Omaha, but we were able to find the cemetery that the family's buried in, and it all started with just a simple Google search. Google Maps, like I mentioned, can be really helpful, not just for finding cemeteries, but also things like funeral homes or churches in the area, or archives, places that might help you to have the records that you're looking for. This is on Family Search. I've mentioned using the catalog a couple of times. You might try something broad in the catalog. In this case, I used, instead of a place search, a title search, looking for something that had Georgia cemetery records in the title. And it came up with 550 results. And that's just one example. So try different things with the catalog and the wiki on Family Search and see what records might be available to you. A more specific search for Salt Lake City cemetery records on Family Search through the catalog came up with 10 different results. So then you click on that collection of records and see what format it's going to be in and how you can search it. Is it indexed or not? Some of the results in the catalog search might be a book, and books can be really surprising with the information that they might have. We'll show you an example here in a minute. You might not have considered city directories, but city directories might provide some helpful death information. These are just a few examples. Most city directories, if they're listing a woman, will actually list if she's a widow, and that can help you narrow down the death date that you're looking for. Here are just a couple examples too of city directories that actually gave the death date for some of the individuals here. So if you can see a city directory, and there's a lot of city directory sources on Family Search and Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, even Fold3 have city directory collections that you can search and see if you can find your family in that directory. This is a website that's not as well known as some of the others. It's deathindexes.com. This is also free. It's an online searchable database with records for the various states in the United States. And you can see that they also have pages for some of the big cities, such as New York and Cincinnati. You click on those links and it opens up a page with detailed information. This is showing information for Nebraska. I went here to this website before we went to Nebraska, and this is how I was able to find exactly which cemetery the family that we were researching is buried in. It's not 100% complete. For example, Nebraska's page does not have every county represented, but it's worth looking at because they might have the place that you are researching. Of course, you need to look at newspapers. Newspapers can be found on a variety of websites. You can go to the wiki, and it has some great pages with links for different various newspaper sites. And not all of them are subscription sites. A lot of states have a free digital newspaper website that you might want to look at. Don't stop just at an obituary. Look at other family records and see if there are other related news articles for the death of that person. I mentioned I'm doing a book right now on tragic deaths on our family tree. We've just recently had one in our family, and it's been really difficult. But this particular book is about non-medical deaths, I guess. Well, technically they're all medical, but not including things like cancer and childbirth deaths and pneumonia or other illnesses. So newspapers have been extremely helpful because usually if there's an unusual type of death, you might find several articles about it or follow-ups. If there was a crime involved, look and see what happened. And if you find one article, maybe a different newspaper reported the same thing, but might include a little bit additional information that might help you more than a different article. So don't stop with just one. Kind of look and see what else you can find. There have been several times where a newspaper had the information about the death of a child, and that's the only record I have of that child. So newspapers can be really vital in your research. Look and see what newspapers are available for the area that you're looking at. And there are newspapers for other countries as well. For example, the British Newspaper Archives is a huge collection of newspapers that's available online as well. So see what you can find. Go to the wiki again and see what it has for newspapers in the area that you are researching. So just a comment about obituaries. When we're looking for the women on our tree, they can be particularly challenging to find. In this example, this is the obituary for Lara Wilson Patillo. Wilson was her maiden name. Lara's name is not mentioned at all in this obituary. She's mentioned as Mrs. Samuel Jackson Patillo. Her daughters are also mentioned by their husbands' names. This is very common. And you can see this is dated 1940. Even today, you might find obituaries that mention the women by their husband's name. So if you're having trouble finding the obituary for a woman on your tree, look at other members of the family, or look for, if you know her husband's name, look for him or her father and see what you can find. Don't get real discouraged if you can't find your Lara. Look for her husband. Here's another example from an obituary that was extremely helpful. I had this Reverend Bennett. This is his obituary. And I did not have marriages for two of his daughters. I had all of the children accounted for on the family tree, but a couple of them I didn't have married. And here you see his daughters are all listed by their husband's name. So I had to find out, well, which of his daughters was Mrs. Wallace Dodd? Which one was Mrs. W.A. Shore? And by going to the census records, I was able to find those men and then determine which of the daughters had married those men and update the information on my tree. Read those obituaries carefully. They might have some wonderful information in there that you didn't already have. Look and see if church records are available. More and more of the Catholic records are being indexed and made available. There are other church records. For example, I know in Cincinnati, there was a large collection of Germans, a German community that attended a German church. And there are books on Family Search for that church. They haven't been indexed. They're in the digital library on Family Search. But when you find the book for that church, you can search for the name using the optical character recognition. And we have been able to find many family members in my brother-in-law's family in that book for that German church. There are Jewish churches in the United States. There are, in this case, this is a Latter-day Saint church record. Look and see if you know what religion your family was a part of. See if there are records available from that area. In the Latter-day Saint church records, you might need to go to the church history library that has a larger collection of records than are found on Family Search. I'm excited because more and more of those church records are being made available through Family Search, but there are more of those church records available in the church history library, and not all of them are available online. So look and see if you can what records are available. You might be fortunate enough to have journal writings about the death of loved ones. Not very long ago, I was excited because I saw that someone had added a new memory to the Reverend Henry Patillo. Henry Patillo and his brother were the original Scottish immigrants that came to the United States in the 1700s. Both of the brothers were not married when they arrived in the United States. Their families have been very well researched, but I have them on I've been following them on Family Search. So if anything gets changed, I get notified. And one day I saw that there was a new memory added, and I was like, well, that's interesting, and was just reading these journal entries because it was interesting. I learned that some of his journal had survived and is at the William Smith Morton Library in the Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. And someone had found that and the transcription of it and added it to Family Search. So I was just reading it because it's interesting and found this entry. This is dated February 20th, 1756. Henry Patillo was married, I think, just the year before. So he was still just a newlywed. And he writes about his wife becoming very sick. So sick that she lost her vision. And then he says, we all feared a miscarriage, she being within 2 months of the regular time of her delivery. And I stopped and looked at the data on Family Search, and there were no children listed there as being born in 1756. So as I read on, he writes about the baby being delivered. He says, on Sunday, the 24th, about noon, she was delivered of a living child, to the astonishment of all present, which was augmented by it being so small and yet complete in every member and every feature, peculiarly beautiful. I love that. But this was a tiny premature baby, and he was afraid it would not live very long. So he says, being doubtful of the life of the little infant, I had it offered to God in my sickness by receiving the seal of baptism, and in memory of my aged mother, named it Jane. So here we have not only the birth date of this child, we know it's a little girl, and he named her after his mother. And then he writes, on Wednesday, the 4th of this month, just after touching on this world, he took it, I trust, to a better. So this baby lived just a few days, but now I have the actual death date too. All of the information that I needed. And this little girl was not recorded anywhere else. So I added her to Family Tree, and we were able to have little Jane sealed to her parents. So satisfying. I still wonder why the person that added that didn't recognize that that little girl was missing from the family unit. My great-great-grandfather, Enoch Bartlett Tripp, kept a lot of journals, and he writes about the deaths of some of his children and their burials. And you might have a journal entry that also might mention the deaths of your family members. Watch for wills and probate records. Be aware that the date the will was written is definitely not the death date. The probate date is going to be closer to a death date, but it at least gives you a place to look for when that individual died. And a will could be very simple, but it might also be packed with a lot of really helpful information. This particular will shows both the day that it was written and the date of probate, and it lists other family members. That's what we like to see, is all of the family members if they are listed in a will. Military records might also help provide you with death information. There's a great collection of records that's applications for headstones or markers. I teach an entire class about military records. There's so many different places to look for military records that might provide you with helpful information, such as that death. This particular application for headstone was surprising to me because it's for a woman. I was researching Joseph Nielsen, and this is his wife, Luella Francie Nielsen. And she was an army nurse during World War I. And that little bit of information led to a wealth of wonderful news articles that helped us to learn all about her career as a nurse. I received a little record hint for this individual, Thomas Patillo, and it's just a tiny little suggestion that says that he was in the Georgia 7th Infantry during the Civil War. So he was in the Confederate Army, and that's all it basically said. But there's a link that said I could visit the partner site, which led me to records on Fold 3. There were 48 pages of records that I could look at. They weren't in chronological order, so I kind of had to sort through them and read every single one, and learned all about his career in the Confederate Army. He was wounded 3 different times. I learned about his death from this little statement: killed at Petersburg, June 19th, 1864. So this is the only record that we have of his death. Watch for things such as pension records. This is a declaration of pension for an Indian war, and they will give the death date of that military person. Look for books. I mentioned books earlier. Libraries such as the Brigham Young University Library and catalogs online such as the Digital Library Collection on Family Search and Google Books have thousands of books that might help you with death information. This is just one page from a book titled The Southern Christian Advocate Marriages and Death Notices and it's at BYU Library. And they just extracted information from these newspapers. You can see this is dated in 1863. Wonderful information that might not be available anywhere else. This is just examples from the Family Search Digital Library. When you find a book on the digital library, you can actually use optical character recognition to search within that book. This is a page from a book called The History of Harris County, Georgia. And here's a close-up of a portion from that page. They went through every cemetery in that county and recorded the information from the headstones. And this was done so long ago that now some of those headstones are not even legible or recorded somewhere else. Watch for things such as necrologies and other records that might have been transcribed and kept in a historical society. Another place that you should look is the GenWeb for United States research. The US GenWeb has pages for every state, and they're all a little bit different. They have different information, but they all have something helpful for that state. They're run entirely by volunteers, so you don't know until you actually get into that website how much information is going to be available. And the format's different for every page, every state page, but it's really a great website. There are so many different places that you can look for substitute death record information. Final just reminder, I can't stress enough, look at the Family Search Wiki for whatever country you're researching and see where you might find information about those death records. Are there collections of wills available? Are there church records available? Don't get locked into just looking for a death certificate or an obituary, because they're not available for everyone all throughout history. But there are a lot more records out there than probably you thought of. I'm going to end with this little quote. This is from Shoestring Genealogy. He said, "You will eventually find yourself thinking like a detective, and that is what all good family historians should do. While examining these records, you will realize that it's true. Dead men do tell tales." There's so much out there, and it's so interesting to learn about what happened to our relatives on our family tree. Can we learn more about their life and their death and find all of those little hidden clues? This is the title of the book that I'm working on, and these are just some of the news articles that we have found. Started the book because I was shocked at how many murders we kept finding on our family tree, both my husband's side and mine. And so we've decided to put some of this into a book form. And sometimes it's been really difficult because it's all tragic and all sad. So I sometimes have to set it aside and leave it for a day or two before I go back to my book. But you'd be surprised at what kind of things you might learn about your family with just a little bit of research.